G'day there. You're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today we're going to be covering a fairly complex topic, but it's to look at how we can manage our tooltips and icons for tools in our add-in as we develop it further. So I'll be covering how you can manage resource and command naming initially using my approach, but then we'll look at how you can actually assign tooltips and images or icons to your tools. And I'm going to be teaching you my approach, which I believe reduces the amount of work required in order to assign tooltips and images very quickly and easily to all your tools. So we will be using the toolbar we've been building so far, so you will want to bring yourself up to speed, ideally with previous videos and ideally your own toolbar. If not, you can check out my GitHub where I have a repository. So to begin with, we have to look at the concept of command naming. So far in my project, we've been using two types of naming conventions. One is for the actual command namespace, or in this case, we have guru.commands underscore the namespace of the command. So for example, general. And then the command itself within the CS file is generally being appended with cmd underscore command name. So this is obviously a very long and clunky and complex name if we wanted to reference it in a piece of code. So we're going to look at the concept of the base name, as I call it, the base command name. If you take out all the bits and pieces that are there to keep it organized in Visual Studio, what are you left with? So for a command namespace or a group, generally we take off the name of your addin.cmds underscore. And then for the command class itself, we also replace the .cmd, leave the underscore, and you end up with the group name underscore command name like this. So we're going to be building a function which will help us achieve this so that we can both work with a command name and also a base name of any command in our project. As well as this, we're going to be looking at the way we get from the command to the base name. So obviously we're going to do this through removing some things. So in this case, we're going to remove guru.cmds. We're also going to remove the cmd just to leave behind the base name of the command. We're going to look at resources as well. So first of all, we're going to be looking at tooltips. This is what you see when you hover over a tool to explain what it does. So in this case, we're going to be using the base name for the tooltip. So if we're dealing with like a pull down that holds a bunch of buttons together, we're going to be associating that to the group or the command.cs class that holds all the commands together. And then we're also going to be referring to the commands using their base name if it's a specific command tooltip, like a push button. From there, we're going to be looking at icon resources. So we're generally going to be also appending two numbers on the end to indicate the resolution of the image that we're referring to as well. And these will be the names we give to our icons. Tooltips, we're going to manage using a resources file. So I'll show you how you can set one of those up. We're going to make sure it's an embedded resource and it's available to the project in memory when it runs, and it gets built into our project when we build it as an add-in. We're going to store the tooltip and its key as a dictionary of keys and values, where the key will be the unique base name of the command that we associate it to, and the value will be the full tooltip we'd like to correlate to that button or pull down. We're also going to access this using a special class that is provided to us through system, in this case the resource manager. Icons are a little bit different, so we're going to be looking at assigning icons in one of two places. First of all, the image property of a button or ButtonData is a 16 by 16 pixel at 96 dpi icon. In this case, we'll be using PNGs. And this will be the one you generally see when the button is smaller, like when it's stacked or if it's collapsed into a quick access tool, the smaller size that you see in Revit. Whereas the large image is going to be a 32 by 32 pixel at 96 dpi icon, in this case a PNG, which will show at the larger resolution such as a push button on the ribbon. We're going to be managing these in PNG files, and we're going to be putting them into subfolders in our resources folder, and we'll be using what's called a resource stream in order to access and then decode this information into the format that we require when we're assigning this in Revit. Streaming is effectively like taking a piece of information from memory and converting it into something typically. So when you read a file as well, for example, like a notepad file, it's sent into memory and streamed and read. So we're going to be using this quite a lot in other videos as well, but I'll explain the concept as we go because there is a particular way we have to do that. In this case, we're going to be decoding into an image source data type, a system data type that Revit API requires in order to set the image and large image properties of tools. The goal here is really to ultimately consolidate all this functionality and make the user process of adding extra tools, giving them tooltips and adding icons to them as simple and reductive as possible so that we don't have to write out too much exhaustive code. We can consolidate these functions, but also make the tooltip entry environment much more navigable. So the resource manager is going to be much easier than writing really long tooltips in code. So we'll show you why that's better as we work as well. So the demo is going to be quite a big, relatively complex one. In this case, we're going to be firstly creating our command to base name conversion step, then setting up our tooltip resource and the means of how we can access that tooltip. Then we're finally going to look at setting up icon files in both a 16 and 32-bit format, pixel format, and then assigning those icons to a push button and developing a method so that we can convert them to image sources, and finally testing our changes in Revit. So quite a lot to do in this video. But by the end of this, we'll be able to really quickly set up other types of tools. So I'm just going to jump into probably actually Revit API. That's just the music. But in this case, we're ultimately setting properties of ButtonData. So in this case, push ButtonData inherits from ButtonData, and the properties we're really interested in are image, large image, and tooltip. We're also going to be setting the name and text of the image, the text being the user visible name of the icon. The name of the item in this case will set to the base name of our command class. But we can see here image requires an image source. And if we check this, it's actually not in the Revit API. It's a system windows.media from the presentation called DLL. It's a different class that the Revit API works with. The large image is the same thing, but at a different resolution. And then the tooltip in this case is going to be a string that will support line breaks, so we can have pretty large tooltips if we want to use that. We're going to be using icons 8 to find an icon to create. Let's maybe just make a test as an icon. Icons 8 is a fantastic website for finding icons generally. Let's just for now just maybe take just a simple one that's got a bit of color, maybe this one. And we're going to just initially download this at 80 by 80 pixels. We're going to come back to this later in Photopea when we create our icon files, just to make sure they're the right resolution, but we'll return there later. So the first step that we need to go through is setting up the command from base name function. So we're going to add this to the ribbon utilities class that we set up earlier. So I'm just going to come down the bottom and just make sure I'm at the right encapsulation. Yep. And we're just going to make a method to get the base name of a command. It's going to be, in this case, a public static string, because we're returning a string. And it's going to be command to base name. And we're going to be providing to this a command name. Actually, a command class in this case. We'll say command name for now, just to keep it simple. So we're just effectively going to be taking this outcome through a few steps. We're just going to do this all in one chain of methods. So we're going to do a method after a method to do two replacements. So first of all, I'm going to return, because we're going to return the outcome of changing the command name. So I'm going to say command name replace. And in this case, the replace method is going to expect what we want to replace and what we want to replace it with. So in this case, I'm going to be using guru dot, in this case, cmds underscore. So that's how we're going to take the first part off. And of course, we're going to replace that with an empty string. On top of that, we're going to also replace .cmd with nothing. And that's how we'll get to the point where we have fix that. That's how we'll get to the point where we've taken off the front and also the middle section, and we're left with the total command base name instead. So it's a very simple method. You could do it inline in code, but we're going to use this in lots of places, so it's easier to write it as a function. So that is effectively the first step covered. Now we're going to have a look at tooltips. So we have to actually create a resource. So in resources, I'm just going to add a new folder, and I'm just going to call this files. And we're going to put generally things like notepad files, text files, Excel templates, and our resources file as well. So I'm going to add a new item, and I'm going to be looking for the resources file in this case. There it is. And in this case, I'm going to call this tooltips.resx. and it's going to set up just a basic resource file for me. So in this case, let's just say we want to have the tooltip for our push button. So in this case, it's actually going to be general_general. Because once you take out the CMDS and the prefix, and you also take out the CMD, which I think is actually, we want it to be general_test, we'll end up with that as our tooltip. And we'll also just add command test2. Now in here, I generally like to jump into a text editor, such as Notepad++, where you have a little bit more flexibility on formatting. So for example, if I just boot up a Notepad session, and I'll say this is a working tooltip, we can do extra lines. I can just paste that in, and I can paste that in, and when I click on there, you'll notice that it sort of increases in size to fit beyond the first line. I prefer just to edit outside because I don't know if you can actually enter new lines. You can do Shift Enter, which I find a little bit unintuitive. But effectively, that is going to be the key and the value of a dictionary of tooltips we're going to be searching through. So now that we have this resources file, you're also generally going to want to make sure that it is set to an embedded resource, which by default in this template it is that we're using. So that is good. And what that should have done is in our manifest, we'll find that further down here, there'll be a section that handles the creation and embedding of the resources file. So it will be compiled into the add-in and then embedded as a resource that we can access later. So that's all done for us automatically. So let's close our resources file. The next step that we need to follow is actually building a function to store our tooltips. So I like to actually register these to globals in case I need them for other purposes later during the running of my tool. So we're going to go back to our globals class that we created in our last lesson. And we're going to be adding an extra dictionary here. So I'm going to say dictionaries for resources. So in this case, we're going to be adding a dictionary. So we're going to go public static dictionary. So when you're declaring a dictionary, you'll notice it's prompting you to open a set of triangles like this. And it's going to ask you what is the key and what is the value you'd like to store. I'm going to say I'm storing a string and a value, a key and a value as a string in both cases. They're both going to be text. You then name your dictionary. So in this case, we'll call it tooltips. We'll make it a get and a set. And in this case, we can, if we want, declare this as a dictionary from the outset, which is probably going to be easier than remembering to create it when we register it. So I can actually say this is a new dictionary. You can see we're prompted through. So this will initialize this property as, in this case, a new dictionary. So now that we have this, we can actually register our tooltips to it. Now this is a little bit of a tricky part, I won't lie. I did end up using AI initially to figure out how to do this step because it is quite complicated, but I'll run you through how the method actually works. So we're going to register our tooltips, and we're going to be running this on the startup of the application as well. So I'm going to make a public static void, because all this is doing is registering the tooltips. I'm going to say register tooltips. Now, in this case, we're going to provide a resource path as a string, just in case we want to register other types of resources in future to the tooltips. But in this case, we're going to be providing that as an argument in our initial startup. So the first thing we need to do is get a resource manager. So in order to do this, the way we can do this is I'm just going to declare a var variable, and I'm going to say new resource manager. In this case, we can see it's got a few different implementations. So I believe the one that we're looking for is going to be this one with a base name and an assembly. So we can see in this case that we're guided to provide two arguments. The first one we're going to provide is going to be the resource path, or the path to our resource that we'd like to load in as the resource manager. I'm then in this case going to have to tell command a few things here. So what I have to write is going to be type of application.assembly. So what is this doing? Well, in this case, the resource manager is being told the assembly that we're working with, which is going to be our assembly, But at the moment, we're just using type of application assembly. Now again, we can actually go to ChatGPT, ask what it's doing, but in this case, we're actually just asking for the application and its assembly. So with that, we then have to get what's called a resource set. We're going to get our resource manager. And we're going to use the get resource set method. It's going to ask us for a few things. The first thing is going to be what's called the culture info. For this one, don't worry. All we have to just do is do culture info.current culture. I think, is that working? Probably made a typo somewhere. I'll just make doubly sure. There we go. So we need the culture info.current culture. That is effectively just going to check on the current thread, what type of resource it's dealing with, I believe. And in this case, we're going to create if not exists as true and try parents as true. So this effectively is just a standard method that I found that loads in resources or resource files. If you want to see a breakdown of all the steps and every single thing, feel free to check out the Microsoft API docs. You'll be able to find all of these methods available with docs and explanations. Or you can feed this into a GPT and it will literally break down every single step for you. But like I said, I did find a lot of this on AI myself. I understand it at a very surface level, but there's a lot of things to break down there that probably just aren't worth understanding. Just understand that this is the resource set or the resource file that we can now work with in our dictionary. So what I'm going to do is now say for each dictionary entry in the resource set, and we can see in this case the dictionary entry is a key value pair, so this is going to be the key and value that come from the resource file in the form of something we can actually work with. I'm firstly going to get the key, so this is going to be the entry.key to string, and that will be the string representation of the key in the resources file. As well as this, we actually need to get the value as well. So I'm going to say value is equal to entry.value to string. And the next step we need is actually to store the key with the value. So in order to do this, we're actually going to call upon our tooltips, which is that globals property. And at the key, at that index in our dictionary, we're making a new key and we're assigning a value. And that's simply how we do it. So what this is going to give us is a dictionary of keys and values that we can look up and find tooltips from. Now, again, I know it's a complicated thing. There's a lot of pretty funny things there that, would probably take a long time to explain. And honestly, I would just be Googling a lot of this to tell you exactly how each little part of this works. But hopefully this at least provides a core function that you can utilize in order to access resource files and dictionaries. And honestly, I find when I work with C#, I'm building a lot of things where I'll remember and forget things, but as long as you have a core function or method that you can call upon and you know how it works, that's actually the most important part of these types of things. So now that we actually have our tooltips, we actually have to go and register our tooltips. So back in our application class on the startup in the region for globals registration. After I've registered my properties, I'm also going to register my tooltips with this new method we just created. The argument we need to provide is going to be a full path to the resource. So in this case, I'm going to go guru.resources, and this is actually the file access path. So we're going guru, resources, files, tooltips. And you shouldn't need to include, in this case, the resx. It's just the name of the actual file or the resource that we're looking for. So at that point in our toolbar, we should now have a dictionary of keys and values that we can look up to assign a tooltip. Now, how do we actually do that? Well, we're going to have to actually get a value from our dictionary. So what I'm going to do is create a more general utility for working with dictionaries to try to find the value of a given key. So we don't just necessarily use this for working with the ribbon. We might find other things we can give this utility with later. So in this case, I'm just going to put it in, I'll probably put it in ribbon utilities for now, but we might come back later and migrate it elsewhere. So I need to create a method to get a value from the dictionary key. I'm going to go public static, and in this case we're going to be getting a string value, or we assume it's going to be a string value, so we're just going to work with string values for now. And I'm going to get dictionary value. We could also call this lookup dictionary. Maybe that's an easier way to understand it. So we're firstly going to provide a key, or sorry, a dictionary. So we're going to say dictionary string. So we're always assuming it's going to be a string value, string key dictionary. We're then going to be looking for a key. So that's the key we're going to look up. And then we're also just going to have a fail value, which by default will be equal to null. And then to begin with, we're going to begin by making our fail value something that is a default. So let's just say that fail value is question mark equal, which remember from a really early lesson, I think it was lesson 3, that's the null coalescing operator, which means if this is null, set it to another value. If not, don't set it. And we'll just say no value was found. So that's going to be our fail case if we can't find our value. I'm then going to be using a pretty tricky approach here. I'm going to explain it as I go. So I'm going to say if, and in this case, we're going to go dictionary try get value. You can see we're being prompted in this case to provide two things. So the first thing is a key. The second thing's a little bit different. It's an out value. So the way that out values work when you encounter them in methods or use them in your own methods is they allow you to access more than one property from the outcome of running a method if you use it within a context or a statement like this one. So what I'm going to do is say key, and I'm going to accept the rest, out string value. So whilst I'm in this encapsulation after this conditional check, I can actually access value. So if we found a value, return value. This will make sure that if the key isn't found, it won't return the value. And at that point, we can instead return the fail value. So this is a little bit of a tricky method, but I find it's a pretty robust method for looking up dictionary keys because you don't have to catch as much logic as you would if you had to write this out every single time you want to access a key in a dictionary. It's important to note that this method only works for a dictionary if it's using strings for both keys and values, and if you're looking up a string. So it's not always going to suit every type of dictionary, but in the case of a tooltip, it's going to be very useful. So we'll just say maybe for now, we'll actually just make it much more literal and say lookup tooltip. We'll just really focus it on doing tooltips. And then now we can say tooltip was found, and we can even go as far as to call our dictionary tooltips. Now, if we want, we could actually not have to specify our tooltips dictionary. So we can actually use our globals from before. So I can get rid of that, and I can actually specify globals.tooltips. So we can now see the value of using a global property. I've made my function simpler. Now all I need to do is provide a key, and it will look up my tooltips dictionary for that key. So we've heavily simplified that process. So now if we go back to our startup method, we're creating a push button in our ribbon setup currently. And at this point, we've got a function for adding the button to the panel. So let's go to it. And if you'll remember way back in this lesson, we actually just assigned a testing tooltip. So what we actually need to do now is instead, we need to get our tooltip. So to do that, we're going to have to get our base name. So we're going to have to get our command class, convert that down to a base name, and we'll work with that. So we go back here to our startup method. And in this case, currently our push button to panel method was asking for a few things. It was asking for the panel, the button name, the class name, the internal name, the assembly path. We're going to really simplify down this approach. So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to provide the class name, and we're also going to provide the button name that the user sees, but we don't need to provide the internal name. We're also not going to need to provide the assembly path because we can get this from globals. So I'm just going to dumb this right down to 3 things. So we have a panel, we have the name we'd like to give the tool, and we have the command class, which I'm just going to break down to that. So at the moment, we're going to get an error because we're not matching the arguments of our method. So we need to go and adjust it. So back in the ribbon utilities, we're going to modify our method. Instead, we're going to have our button name, which the user sees, and our class name, but we don't need an internal name or an assembly path. So what are we going to do? Well, before we even create a push button data object to specify our push button information, we're going to get our base name. So var base name is going to be equal to, in this case, we can actually get the function because it's in the same area. So we need to look for command name to base name. And we're going to take the class name and convert that down, in this case, to the base name. Now instead, we can skip a few steps here. So the internal name is going to be the base name that the user doesn't see behind the scenes for our tool. The button name still comes from our arguments. And in this case, the assembly path can be globals.assembly path. And then our class name, which is coming from our arguments. So we're starting to simplify our tool. Now, because we have a base name available, we can also ask for a tooltip. So we can use lookup tooltip. And in this case, we can look for a key, which is going to be base name. And we don't need to specify the fail value. So we now have the capability of accessing tooltips for these objects as well. We're going to look at images after this, but for now, let's actually just test that our tooltip system is working as intended. So there's quite a lot of steps there, so it's good to test every now and then. Now, the first thing we can check is there's no errors, which is good. And if I do, in this case, try to run a debug on Revit 2023, we should hopefully launch without issues. Looks good. So what's happening now is we're loading our global resource for dictionaries. So in this case, that should be happening when we load. And after that, with that dictionary available, a push button will get created with the method and try and go and access our tooltips. And we should hopefully have a tooltip working. And that will be step one. Cool, looks good, no errors. And if I just jump into a new project, we should hopefully see our tooltip on our push button. So we can see our tab, which is good. And if I hover over, and there we go, we can see we've successfully found our tooltip for our push button, and we've only had to use a command class. We haven't had to specify base names, tooltips in full, and that's pretty much the first step done. And the good thing about this now is that when we create other tools, we're not going to have to go and create lots of extra steps in order to do this for other push buttons. We've captured our logic in one key method that runs all of this for us. So the next step is a little bit harder. I know harder, that was probably already quite hard, right? But we're going to start setting up icons. So I'm just going to go to resources and add, I'm actually going to modify this. I'm going to add a new folder and I'm going to call this icons 16. And I'm also going to add another one and call it icons 32. So I like to keep icons separate based on their resolution. It's easier to manage them, I find. So in this case, we're going to go and actually just create a basic icon. So I've already went and downloaded an icon. So what I'm going to do is create a new file in Photopea. I'm going to make it by default 96 by 96 at 96 dpi, just to begin with. Slightly higher resolution than we need. And I'm just going to open up, in this case, that icon that we downloaded. Copy it in, I'll just leave it at that resolution, that's fine. And we can see it's got an alpha channel, which is good, so it's all good to go. Maybe I'll make this slightly bigger. And now that we've got this the way we want it, let's downsize to 32 by 32, but keep the DPI at 96 by 96 DPI. And then we're gonna keep going down to 16 by 16. And that should create some files in my downloads. In this case, we're going to want to call this one general underscore test 32 and general underscore test 16. So this is the base name of the command combined with the resolution icon or the icon resolution. Back in our project, I'm going to right click on my icon 16 and add existing item, show all files. Go to downloads and pick my 16 by 16 icon and likewise pick my 32 by 32. And in their properties, you're going to want to make sure, in this case, that they are an embedded resource. And what I like to do after that is go to the manifest, and you'll find some build actions here. So what you can actually do is make these more generic. You can just say star. And when we add extra resources in future, two things are going to happen. So first of all, Visual Studio is going to assume that you want to treat any resources that enter this folder in future as embedded. As well as that, Visual Studio is going to know to embed all PNG files in these subfolders in my project for me, and I won't have to right click and select embed every time. So that will definitely save some time. Okay, so we have our icons. They're available as resources, but how do we actually access them? Well, this is the hard part. We actually need to access them as an image source in the system library, as we saw before in the Revit API. So in this case, I'm going to create a new utility. But now I'm just going to put it in ribbon utilities just to keep things simple, but I might migrate it out to a file utility library later. I'll just say method to get an icon as an image source. So public, static, and in this case, we're going to specify an image source as our return type. And we're just going to say, in this case, get icon. And from this, we're also then going to need to provide some arguments. We're going to firstly need to say what is the icon name, so it can find it. We also need to provide a resolution. So in this case, I'm going to provide the resolution as an integer. And by default, I'm going to make it 32. And I'm just going to leave this for later. In fact, I might leave that out altogether. We'll come back to that later when we're looking at dark mode icons, just to keep things simple. So in this case, and I might say get icon source or as source. Just trying to think what the easiest way to describe this is. No, we'll use get icon. We'll keep it really simple at the user level. So the first thing we need to do is actually get our resource path. So we're going to be constructing a string to make sure we always get to the right folder and the right image name. So the icon name in this case we're going to be providing is probably more what you might call a base name. So we'll call this base name. So I'm going to say var resource path is equal to, and you might recall from a previous lesson, if you do a $sign and you start a string, this string can now support variables as part of the string. So I'm now going to say guru, and I'm going to say dot sources, dot icons. Now we can be in icon 16 or 32. So what we need to do is put in the resolution, and we're putting that in curly braces, and that will insert this as a string. From there, we put a dot, and now we want the base name. And we also want the resolution again. And finally, we want .png. So that will always be a full path to the icon for the base name that we want based on the resolution we're asking for. From here, we actually need to stream this resource. So the way I'm going to do this is using a using statement, which if you've used Python before, it's a little bit like using a with statement. And I'm going to say var stream is equal to, and I'm going to call on my assembly. And as we can see, C# sort of knows what we want to do. We want to get the manifest resource stream, and we want to get the resource path. So simply put, what this is doing is streaming the resource in our project in the assembly. So we're going to the manifest, getting the resource, and this will give us access to that PNG resource. Firstly, I need to make sure the stream actually worked. So I'm going to say if stream is null, then we just return null. Nothing comes out. Just in case I make a typo in future or something doesn't work, because we'll have issues loading our add-in if not. The next step, now that we've made sure that we're actually going to get our stream, is we actually need to go and get it. So in this case, I'm going to create a decoder. So what I'm going to do, there's a few steps here, and again, it's a little bit complicated. I'll try and explain it as I go. But we're going to create a new PNG bitmap decoder. And it's going to ask for a few things. The first thing is the bitmap stream, which we have. So we're going to provide the stream. From there, we need the bitmap creation options. And in this case, the main thing we need is just to preserve the pixel format to make sure that our 16 and our 32-bit pixels and their DPI are respected in the way it's streamed. From there, it's going to ask us for a bitmap cache option. And we don't really need one, so in this case, we're just going to be using default. We're just using the default behavior. Now, there is another implementation, I believe, from there that uses a URI or a unique resource identifier, but we're working with a stream. So that's it. Now, sometimes that can be a little bit hard to read. It's getting quite long, so you might want to put these on new lines like this. But at that point, we should now have a decoder object. So what we can do with this decoder object, now that it actually exists, is return its first frame. So I'm going to say return decoder.frames.first. And you can also just use a standard indexing format alternatively. That will effectively return the frames. So in this case, if you want to be really safe, you can also make sure your decoder actually has frames. So I can say if decoder frames count is greater than 0, return decoder frames first. That way, if the decoder for some reason accesses a resource with no frames, which would be a bad resource, it doesn't cause an error. And then we can also just return null. And at that point, that is effectively the method we will use to get the image source by decoding it as a resource in a manifest stream. Now again, complicated, but what you can do is you can feed this code into ChatGPT and other types of resources like it, and it will give you a very concise breakdown of this if you're confused about any of those steps. And I do encourage you to start thinking about doing that in your general coding workflow, especially if there's steps that you think I've skipped or things I haven't explained. Whilst you can ask me in the comments, just remember AI is pretty good at working with code as well. So at that point, the last thing we need to do is actually assign these icons. So where are we going to do that? Well, we're going to go back to our push button to panel. And you might recall that we left these for later. This is where we're actually going to assign our icons. So I'm going to take off the comment. And you might recall that the image property is the 16 by 16 pixel and the large image is the 32 by 32. So in this case, we're going to be doing the get icon, and the base name is the base name, which we have from before. And the resolution, which we need to use a colon to specify because it's an argument with a default value, is going to be 16 in this case. For 32, it's going to be the same, but 32. So that should effectively round up our icons in the 16 and the 32-bit resolution and assign them to our push button. So a lot was covered there, right? It was pretty intense, but the good news is now, when you're creating a push button, so much of the logic is created for you now by all the steps we've just done. At the application startup level, this is all you need to do to create a push button with a tooltip and icons. You just need to make sure you get the command class right, give it a name that you want on the ribbon, and we also need to just say what panel is this going on. Super simple, right? As long as you get your icon name right, you add a resource in the tooltips file, and if you don't, there's a catch to make sure, but that's pretty much it. So in this case, let's just run a test. So there's no errors that we can see. We hit run, and fingers crossed we will see the icon, in this case in the 32 by 32-bit resolution because it's a push button. But if it did go into a scenario where it was 16 by 16, we would see it in that resolution as well. But fingers crossed, we just see that notepad sitting on our button. And if you've made it this far, well done. I know we've covered a lot of things. It's quite complicated. I promise in the next few lessons, we're not really going to be relying on anything quite so system level like we have in this tutorial. So fingers crossed that we see an image. Come on, and we do, there we go. So we have a tooltip and we have icons working for this button. Pretty cool, right? And if we add it to the quick access toolbar, then we can see the 16 by 16 resolution icon in action as well, all working as intended. So it's always nice when something actually works in testing. So I'll be doing a bit of cleanup on the code here in the version on GitHub, but effectively that will be the code that you have to work with. in future versions. If for some reason you find you're falling behind progress, you can always catch up by using my toolbar where it stands at a point in time. So there we go, quite a lot covered in that lesson. If you want to see the implementation of this in my own toolbar, this is exactly how I do it in GWiz, and you'll see lots of other cool techniques there as well that we're going to cover progressively through the weeks. So thanks for watching today. If you like what you saw, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share, and you can contact me at the email below or in the comments. And just a reminder, if you're very confused by anything you saw there, try feeding it into ChatGPT. You'll get some good explanations. I'm more than happy to explain things in the comments as well, though, of course, because I know that was a pretty complicated lesson. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you in future similar videos. Thanks. Take care.